I returned to the coastal forests of Washington alone, carrying my father's ashes in a wooden urn I couldn't bring myself to open. The elk migration routes he'd walked as a boy called me back, though we'd barely spoken in 15 years. My camera gear felt heavier than usual as I hiked into the old growth, each step on the moss-covered trail an apology I'd never get to voice. The September mist clung to everything like unfinished conversations. The ranger station had been abandoned for 2 seasons, leaving me truly isolated in these cathedral groves of Douglas fir and Sitka spruce. I told myself I came for the photography, for the chance to document the herds in their ancient patterns. But grief has a way of pulling us toward the places where answers might hide in shadow and silence. My father grew up in these woods, learned their secrets, and left me only questions wrapped in regret. I set up camp in the clearing he described in one of his rare letters, the one overlooking the valley where fog pools like spilled milk at dawn. The forest breathed around me with a presence I couldn't name, watchful and patient. Something about the light filtering through the canopy felt like being observed by gentle, invisible eyes. I should have recognized it then as a threshold. That first night, I dreamed of footsteps circling my tent, massive and deliberate. When I woke, the forest had fallen into an impossible silence, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting. On the third night, the forest broke its silence with a sound I'll carry to my grave. It began as a low rumble that seemed to rise from the earth itself, then climbed into a mournful wail that echoed through the valley, like a funeral hymn sung in a language older than words. My breath caught in my chest as the call repeated, each note vibrating through my ribs with a sorrow so profound it felt almost human. No elk, no wolf, no bear I'd ever recorded made a sound that carried such weight of centuries. I fumbled for my audio recorder with shaking hands, but the vocalization had already faded into the darkness between the trees. My trail cameras were positioned along the game trails, their infrared sensors blinking like patient red eyes in the night. Sleep became impossible as I lay listening to the forest resettle itself around that absence of sound, as if the trees were processing what they'd witnessed. When dawn finally came, pale and hesitant, I hiked out to check the cameras with a mixture of dread and desperate curiosity. The footage stopped my heart. Frame by frame, a towering shadow moved through the background of the third camera, passing between ancient firs with a grace that defied its massive size. It walked upright, bipedal, its gait deliberate and purposeful as it paused at the edge of the ravine opposite my camp. For 3 seconds it stood perfectly still, and I could see the broad slope of shoulders, the sagittal crest of its skull catching moonlight. Then it turned its head directly toward the lens. Those eyes in the infrared glow weren't the blank shine of animal eyeshine. They held depth, intelligence, and something else that made my throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Recognition, perhaps, or assessment, or a sadness that seemed to span generations. I watched the clip 17 times, zooming in until the pixels fractured, searching for proof I wasn't losing myself to grief and isolation, but each viewing only deepened the certainty settling in my bones like cold water. My father's woods held a secret that had been watching me since I arrived, and it knew exactly who I was. I stopped eating, stopped maintaining any pretense of the assignment that brought me here. The elk migration became an afterthought as I reviewed that footage in an obsessive loop, my laptop screen glowing in the tent like an altar to something I couldn't name. Each viewing revealed new details that rational thought couldn't dismiss. The way it distributed its weight before stepping, testing the ground with an awareness that spoke of deep intelligence. The proportion of its arms, longer than human but purposeful in their positioning, suggested something that had evolved not in parallel to us, but along a path we'd forgotten existed. On the 4th night, I repositioned my cameras in a wider perimeter, creating a net of electronic witnesses around my camp. The compulsion felt less like scientific curiosity and more like a conversation I was trying to initiate with the darkness itself. I left my campfire burning later than necessary, a beacon or an invitation, while the forest watched with its 1,000 invisible eyes. The waiting transformed me, stripped away the urban armor I'd carried into these woods, leaving only the raw core of someone seeking answers to questions his father never spoke aloud. The creature returned. Just after midnight, and this time I was standing outside my tent when it emerged into the clearing across the ravine. Distance and moonlight made it seem almost spectral, its fur catching silver light like frost on ancient stone. We regarded each other across that gulf of space and species, and I felt my father's absence like a severed thread. Between us, a connection this being had known, and I was only beginning to understand. Something shifted in my chest during those suspended moments. Not fear departing, but expanding into something larger that held room for wonder, for grief, for the terrible beauty of standing at the threshold of a mystery that had chosen me. The creature tilted, its head with an almost questioning gesture before melting back into the trees, leaving me trembling with the weight of inheritance I hadn't known I was carrying. I found the place at dawn, following the trajectory of its retreat with a tracker's instinct I didn't know I possessed. The footprints pressed deep into moss-covered earth, each one a revelation that rewrote biology textbooks sleeping in university libraries. They measured 18 inches long, the weight distribution showing a mid-tarsal break that no human foot could replicate. Yet the deliberate spacing between them spoke of measured thought, of intention rather than mere animal wandering. The twisted branches formed symbols I recognized from margins of my father's field notebooks, geometric patterns I dismissed as absent-minded doodles during his cancer treatment. Now they hung above me like a language written in wood and shadow, marking territory or perhaps offering meaning to those who'd learned to read this sylvan scripture. The cairn waited in the center of the clearing, stones balanced with impossible precision, identical to the ones my father built during our last fishing trip when his hands still remembered strength. I knelt before it and understood this wasn't a trail marker, but a grave of sorts. A memorial to every human who'd kept the faith of silence. My fingers traced the weathered surfaces, and I felt the accumulated weight of reverence, of promises made between species across generations. Something had been watching my bloodline, keeping a covenant older than the timber companies and survey maps. When I placed my own stone atop the cairn, the forest seemed to exhale around me, accepting an oath I'd made without words. Back at camp, I tore through my father's belongings with trembling hands until I found it, a leather journal wrapped in oilcloth, hidden in the false bottom of his old field kit. The pages fell open to entries spanning 40 years, each one documenting encounters written in his precise hand. December 1973, left salmon at the old cedar, gone by. Morning, along with my doubts. April 2006. Heard the calls again, closer this time, like grief given voice. The entries revealed a man I'd never known, someone who'd chosen this secret over his own family. While I was growing up feeling abandoned by his long absences, he'd been here, maintaining a vigil between two worlds. The betrayal burned through my chest until I reached the final pages, dated just weeks before his diagnosis. If my son reads this, he'll think me mad, but madness has kept this land sacred when reason would have paved it. His sketches filled the margins, enormous handprints beside human ones, the creature rendered in careful charcoal strokes, its eyes holding an intelligence that defied classification. One passage struck me breathless. It mourns like we do. I've seen it stand vigil over its dead for 3 days, the same way my father did for my mother. I understood then that my inheritance wasn't abandonment, but an impossible choice he'd made to protect something that had no other guardian. The anger I'd carried for years dissolved into something more complex. recognition that love sometimes wears the mask of absence. I extinguished my lantern and waited in the suffocating darkness, my father's journal pressed against my chest like a talisman. The forest held its breath around me, and then I heard it, not the distant calls from previous nights, but the deliberate crack of branches, the whisper of something massive moving with surprising care. Through the tent's mesh window, I saw its silhouette materialize from the tree line, each step measured and cautious, as though approaching a frightened animal it didn't want to startle. My rational mind screamed to run, but my father's words anchored me in place. It responds to stillness, not panic, to reverence, not fear. The creature stopped at the edge of my camp, close enough that I could hear its breathing, deep, rhythmic, almost meditative. It wasn't hunting or threatening, but observing, and in that observation I felt the weight of countless years of watching humans come and go while it remained, eternal and alone. I stepped outside, my legs barely supporting me, and we regarded each other across 20 feet of moonlit ground. Its eyes caught the silver light with an amber glow, and I saw in them what my father had described. Not the blankness of an animal, but the heavy awareness of a thinking being, carrying the burden of remembering what others have forgotten. It reached down with one massive hand and placed something on a flat stone before retreating into shadow. A river-worn piece of jade my father always wore, returned now like a covenant passing between generations. Dawn arrived like a held breath, finally released, bleeding pale gold, through the ancient cedars and filling the ravine with shifting veils of mist. I stood at the clearing's edge, where my father's journal said he'd come for 30 years, the jade still warm in my trembling hand. The air felt charged with expectation, and then the mist itself seemed to take form, the creature emerging not with violence, but with the slow dignity of a thing that had earned its right to exist here long before roads or names. We faced each other across ground my father's feet had worn smooth, and I understood with sudden, crushing clarity that this was a threshold moment my bloodline had been moving toward for decades. Its eyes held mine with an intelligence that made my throat tighten, and I saw reflected there the same grief I'd carried since my father's death, the ache of words unspoken, of distance that could never be closed. This being knew that pain intimately had watched its kind fade into legend while it remained. The last keeper of a covenant humans had abandoned. It raised one massive hand and pressed it against its chest, then extended the gesture toward me, a question without words that demanded an answer my entire future hinged upon. My father had chosen this lonely guardianship over the comfortable lies of normal life, had sacrificed connection with his own son to protect something the world insisted didn't exist. Now that same choice stood before me, offering and asking in equal measure. The creature's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, something like hope flickering in those ancient eyes, and I realized it wasn't just asking if I would protect this place. It was asking if I would see it, truly see it, and choose not to look away. I dropped to my knees and pressed my palm against the earth where my father's offerings had worn the moss away. Decades of smoked fish, carved tokens, and whispered promises left in darkness. The creature stepped closer, each footfall silent, despite its impossible size, and I understood this ritual had been my inheritance long before I knew it existed. My father hadn't abandoned me. He'd been preparing me, teaching me solitude and observation, training me to see what others dismissed as shadow and myth. The jade in my hand suddenly felt like a key passed between generations, unlocking a purpose that made every painful childhood memory snap into focus. It knelt before me in the mist, bringing those sorrowful eyes level with mine, and extended something clutched in its massive hand, my father's old compass, the one that vanished years ago. The silver was tarnished, but the inscription remained. Some paths choose the walker. My father had left it here as a final message. Proof that he'd known I would come, that I would stand exactly where I stood now. The creature had kept. It's safe all this time, waiting for the son to find what the father had protected. I reached out with shaking fingers and accepted the compass, our hands nearly touching across the unbridgeable distance between species, between worlds. In that moment, I felt the weight of every developer's blueprint, every logging permit, every survey map that threatened to reduce this sacred ground to lumber and profit. My father had stood as a wall between progress and preservation, absorbing the loneliness that came with secrets too dangerous to share. Now that wall was crumbling, and only I remained to rebuild it. The creature touched its chest again, then mine, then gestured to the forest around. Us a covenant sealed in silence and recognition. I nodded once, feeling the last threads of my old life fall away like shed skin, accepting a guardianship that would cost me everything normal and give me something the world had forgotten was possible. My father's path had led here, and now it was mine to walk, alone, but witnessed by something that would outlive every choice I made. The rumble of diesel engines reached us before dawn, a mechanical growl that shattered the ancient silence like glass. The creature's head snapped toward the access road, every muscle tensing beneath its dark fur, and I felt its anguish ripple through the mist between us. It rose to full height, 9 feet of living mythology, and released a howl that seemed to tear from the very roots of the mountains. The sound carried generations of grief, a lamentation for every sacred place swallowed by progress and forgetting. I ran toward the road with my father's compass clutched in my fist, my camera bag abandoned in the clearing behind me. 3 bulldozers sat, gleaming yellow in the half-light, survey stakes stabbed into the earth like accusatory fingers. The crew wouldn't arrive for another hour, but their equipment had already violated the boundary my father died defending. I thought of the footage on my memory cards, proof that would stop the development, ignite global attention, and doom the creature to a life of persecution, study, and exploitation. My phone felt impossibly heavy as I scrolled through the files, decades of my father's careful protection balanced against one click of exposure. The creature watched from the tree line, eyes reflecting the screen's glow, trusting me with a choice it couldn't understand. I thought of him spending his final years here alone, choosing isolation over revelation, love over legacy. His silence had been the greatest gift he could offer, not to me, but to something that existed before names and nations. I deleted every file, then smashed the memory cards beneath my boot heel until only fragments remained. The plastic shards scattered across the earth like shed scales, and with them went my career, my credibility, any proof I'd ever ventured into these hills. I called the Environmental Coalition from a payphone in town, speaking in my father's careful language about sacred indigenous sites and protected watersheds, weaving truth and misdirection until the lawyers took interest. The development stalled in litigation, buried under paperwork instead of revelation, and I became what my father had been, a quiet saboteur armed with nothing but devotion and time. I returned to the forest every season now, leaving offerings at the stone cairns and walking the boundaries with surveyor's precision. The creature appears less frequently as the years pass, but I feel its presence in the arranged branches, the watchful silence, the sense of being accompanied by something older than loneliness. Sometimes I glimpse it on distant ridges at twilight, a shadow keeping vigil over land that remembers when humans knew how to be grateful. We are both guardians now, bound by unspoken covenant and inherited purpose. My own son asks why I disappear into the woods for weeks, why I've chosen this strange hermit existence, and I tell him only that some debts transcend explanation. One day he'll find my journals as I found my father's, and he'll face the same impossible choice between exposure and protection. The secret grows heavier with each generation, but so does the honor of carrying it. The last time I saw the creature, it touched its massive palm to a cedar trunk where I'd carved my father's initials, and I understood finally what he'd been trying to tell me in those final confused moments, that love sometimes means becoming invisible, that the greatest legacies are the ones nobody knows we've left behind. What would you sacrifice to protect something the world has forgotten? Subscribe to witness more encounters that blur the line between myth and memory.